All right, good morning, everyone. In our last class, we started with AWS Cloud Practitioner, and we introduced ourselves to the overall objective of Cloud Practitioner. Then today, I will be sharing with you the Cloud Practitioner study guide for those people that wants to write the Cloud Practitioner exams. So also on last week, we talked about we started with Cloud Practitioner, and we look at the basics of Cloud Practitioner and the overall objective that we are going to cover in the Cloud Practitioner. So let me take you a little bit back to the modules. Yeah, if you can see it. So our first module was the introduction to the AWS Web Services. And then today we are going to start with AWS Global Infrastructure and Reliability. Then we are going to look at the compute in the cloud. All of this topic, as I said earlier in our last class, that majority of this topic, you will still meet them in solution architect. So please pay as much as possible attention in order to gain the valuable skills. And when we get to the solution architect, you will not be struggling to catch up with the class, because this is just the basic information about cloud, and it's not necessarily pertain to AWS alone. It's virtually all the cloud. Everything you study here is applicable in other cloud platforms. So, but the major thing we are covering this aspect first is to ensure that by the time we get to the solution architect, which is going to be a little bit speed compared to this and more technical than this, and so you won't be struggling. So that's why we first learning this. And majority of the topic we are having here, we're still going to discuss some of them in the solution architect. But when we get to solution architect, any of the topic that we discuss now, I may not spend too much time on it. So this is the best time to pay attention so that you can get everything that will help you when we get to the solution architect. All right, I'm not saying because this is the basic one, so that I'm not reducing or taking anything away from it. I'm giving you everything. If we get to solution architect, whatever I cover here is still going to be valid, and they're still going to be exactly the same thing. So today we are going to start with AWS Global Infrastructure. All right. AWS Global Infrastructure. As we all know that cloud is just another data center, a data center that the clients, which are called the cloud consumer, do not own. Another person holds the data center, but the client, the cloud consumer, wants or use the data center that belongs to another person. So one major issue because cloud is not just coming out now, it has been out since, but a lot of companies do not use cloud because they don't trust the security on the cloud. And one major concern is that what if a particular data center that they are hosting their resources, what if that data center goes down? What is going to happen? So as time goes on, all the cloud provider, they start providing more solutions. And one thing they do is that they make sure that they have a lot of data center, so that if one data center goes down, then there is another data center that will be up and running, so that the consumer, the customers' data will always at every point in time be available to them, which they call highly available architecture. So the AWS data center is exactly the same thing. AWS have a lot of data centers everywhere or around the globe. So in order for AWS and their customer, in order to make it easy for AWS customer to be able to deploy resources in this data center, and also be able to specifically say, okay, this is the data center I'm deploying my resources in. AWS make something. They categorize their data center in forms of, they use some elements or some keywords to name or categorize their data centers. And those keywords or those elements are those, or are what we are going to be looking at today. So the first thing we are going to be looking at is the global AWS Global Infrastructure Overview. That is, what are those things that actually form, or those things that have actually formed the global infrastructure, which are the elements of the global infrastructure. So we're going to be looking at the overview of the global infrastructure. We're going to look at the elements of the global infrastructure. We're going to also look at the understanding the some of the AWS global infrastructure elements. The first one we are going to look at is the region. Then after the region, we're going to look at the availability zones. AWS use region, availability zones, and the cloud AWS local zones to categorize or name their data center, so that whenever a customer is deploying resources in their data center, they know exactly where they want to deploy their resources. So also, we are going to be looking at not really a data center, but a way that, or a site that Amazon use to move content closer to their customers. Remember the other day that I was saying that if I have customers in another part of the world, one challenge is with physical server is that customers in very far parts of the world, we have to if they have to access my site, it's going to be kind of extremely slow to them. So in order to solve this, I might have to move my data center or my business closer to the customer. But AWS provide another way of moving your own resources closer to your customer without moving the entire business or the server that is serving that customers or those customers. Then after this, we're going to test our knowledge with some knowledge check to see whether we actually comprehend what we learn. So after we check the knowledge check, after the knowledge check, we are going to move to another topic, still on the AWS, not actually on the AWS Global Infrastructure, but for the first time, we are going to be interacting with our own AWS account. So with this, we are going to be interacting with the AWS services that we are going to be looking at for this training. And there are multiple ways of interacting with AWS account or with interacting with AWS services. And the most common way of interacting with AWS services is through the management console. So we are going to be demonstrating some tasks, or we are going to be demonstrating how to use the management console or getting ourselves familiar with the management console. After all of this topic, what you should come out with, or what you should have learned about after you participate in this topic, are these. We are going to understand the AWS Global Infrastructure. This is very, very common, especially in class practitioner. You're going to see some question about it. In solution architect, people tend to ask about it because they want to know whether you can make a decision for company, whether to use a region or to be specific about an availability zone when you are creating a product. Especially local zone and edge location. They are edge location are very, very much important, but local zone is not as common as edge location, region, and availability zone, but it's actually available to be used. So these are the objectives. You're going to be able to identify and explain the roles of AWS region and availability zones. You're going to be able to understand what a edge location is and their impact on networking performance. Then you're going to gain insight into how to effectively interact with AWS infrastructure. So our first topic is going to be AWS Global Overview and the elements of AWS Global Infrastructure. So as I said earlier, that AWS have a lot of data centers around the globe. These data centers are spread virtually everywhere. AWS has a lot of data centers. And all these data centers, they are categorized, or they are connected one way or the other. Any data centers that are closer to each other, AWS see them as a particular location. So AWS have series of means of categorizing their data centers. So let's look at the elements of data center, what actually form these data centers. The first thing that we're going to look at on the data center is the region. Then after that, we're going to look at the availability zone, followed by the local zone, and finally, we're going to look at edge location. There is another one that I will be talking about, which I do not include here because before it wasn't part of cloud. It wasn't part of cloud practitioner, but I've been seeing some questions on cloud practitioner that they have included them in their question. And this is the outpost, AWS outpost and AWS wavelength. I'm going to be explaining both of them. So let's take a look at the AWS region and availability zone. When we talk about AWS region, this is just a geographical location. So when AWS develop and when they create their data center, you remember I said the AWS data center are spread across the globe. So any data center that are kind of closer to each other, AWS name that particular area a region, just like the way branches, the way banks created their branch everywhere. When they have a multiple branch in a particular place, let's say in Houston, Texas, they may call that all those banks, they may find a regional, there will be a regional headquarters in that particular place. So the same concept is what AWS used, that all the data centers that are in a particular or a specific geographical location, they name that as a region. So what does that mean? It means that in a particular region, there can be more data centers in one particular region. And each of these data centers is not that they are extremely next door to each other. They just spread across a particular or a specific geographical location. So when you want to deploy a particular resources, then you have the chance of picking the specific geographical location that you want to deploy your resources in. One, when you are deploying, somebody say my camera is blank. Can you guys see me?
No, it's blank.
Oh,
no, it's blank. We can't see you.
No, it's blank. We can see it.
Blank.
But can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yes, the presentation is good. Yeah.
Yes, we can see the presentation, but we cannot see your
We can see the
camera.
presentation.
Oh, really? Okay, hold on. Let me. And now, stay blank.
Yep, but we saw your AWS whatever before you went up. That was it.
Okay, just let me see.
Just to see the lens is covered or something.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Just to see the lens is covered.
Yeah, I think something is going wrong because it wasn't pointing to me. It was pointing down. So let me just rectify that really quick. So can you see me now?
Now?
Oh. No. Okay, 1 more second. And now?
Yes, now we can see it.
Yes.
Okay, that means unfortunately there is this thing that I want to use. I won't be able to use it then. I want to be able to annotate, but I have to switch. Okay, I'll find a solution to that error. So you guys can complain because you didn't see me now. And let me see how many people I can see here. Almost everybody, except 3 people.
Okay, now everybody come on camera, please. It's just fair enough.
So anybody that does not see me should not complain because I'm not seeing you guys too. Yeah.
Can you
All
see
right, thanks
me?
for telling me. Actually, I didn't know.
Oh.
All right, where are we? Okay. So, okay, let me start recording back. I paused it earlier. Let me see, can I still annotate now? Yeah. Yeah, I can't annotate, sorry. Yeah. You guys can see my screen now, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, initially I wanted to pause the recording, but I paused this sharing. Okay. So, yeah, let's see. Can you guys see what I did on the screen now?
Yes, we can see.
Like
Yep.
a crash? Okay.
What
Yes,
are you
you're
writing?
writing. Yeah, with a pen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That means my annotation is working. That's what I shall be doing. All right. That's the purpose I'm using Zoom, because I was unable to annotate in the last batch, which we were using Teams. So that's why I switched to Zoom. I don't really like Zoom anyway, but you can annotate, that is good. So, okay, I'm going to take the region again. So when AWS spread their resources across the globe, these resources, in order to categorize them, in order to make it easy for customers to deploy resources and to know where they are deploying their resources, AWS used the concept of global infrastructure. This global infrastructure were divided into separate, or there are some elements, they are composed of some elements where we have the region. So how does the region comes in? AWS categorized together all the data center that they are closer in a specific geographical location, and they name that AWS region. So when they name this AWS region, each region location. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
So if you are not talking to the class, please can you mute yourself? There is a lot of background noise. Okay, so each of these region has a clusters of data centers, meaning that in one particular region you see a lot of data centers, but AWS tends to do something like they do not want all the data center to just be categorized as one region. So every data center that are in a particular geographic location, they call all those one under all those data center as parts of a particular region. So if you are in, for instance, now in USA, we have 4 regions, and there are reasons why AWS specifically call all of this region, because when we get to another slide, we're going to be seeing different ways of picking, the categories or factors for selecting a particular region. So there are a lot of regions, but as at this training, AWS has 33 regions spread across the globe. AWS have some region in Asia, they have in Africa, they have in Europe, they have in America here, and they have in Canada. So all of this region, you can specifically select any region where you want to deploy your resources. Then all these data centers in a specific geographical location, because since all of them are not in the same area or in the same building, they are kind of a little bit farther than each other. So all those data centers that are closer to each other, they are in the like 60 miles away from each other. AWS named them availability zones. So an availability zone is a data center, but inside an availability zone, you can have more than one data centers in an availability zone. But any data centers that are closer to each other, they make them inside a single availability zone. So the purpose for this availability zone is to address the challenges of customers. Like, okay, what if data centers go down? What happens to my data? So AWS makes sure that if you want to deploy your data, if you want to deploy your resources in the cloud, then you can deploy that resources in two or more different data centers. But these two or more different data centers, they are connected together. So, but this is different from region, because there are some compliance that say, okay, a particular country or a particular state's data cannot be in another country's data. I mean, it cannot be in another country, like the GDPR that say the data of European citizens cannot be outside of Europe without the consent of the customers. So in that case, if a customer cannot specify a particular data center that they are deploying their resources on the cloud, then before you know it, they might deploy a customer's data center out of the region, which goes against the GDPR. So that is why one of the reasons why we have the region, the concept of region, so that the customer can know by the time they are passing a specific region. But the availability zone is more to provide highly available resources for customers, so that when a customer is deploying their resources, they can deploy their resources in multiple data centers without crossing that region. So that is the concept of availability zone. And in an availability zone, there are one or more data centers. But in a region, there are at least 3 availability zones in a region. But in a data center, there are a data center can have an availability zone can have 1 data center or more, while a region has at least 3 data centers. So all data centers in an AWS region are connected. So if you are deploying a resources in a particular region, then you can deploy that resources in multiple availability zones in that region, because they are all interconnected. Though they are connected, but they are not in the same building. So what that means is that if anything happens to one particular data center, then the other data center are not affected. So with this, we can now achieve one of the cybersecurity goals or objective, which is availability zone. Which is highly available, which means that your data or your resources should always be available for legitimate customers. So this actually addresses the challenges that customers always have before that. What happens if the resources that they deploy in the cloud, what happens if the cloud goes down, or if the data center goes down? So with the concepts, or with the introduction of availability zones now, customer can deploy their resources in multiple data center, which they can also spread within the same availability zones. So one thing about this availability zone is that because they are connected, they are interconnected, they tend to provide what is called a low latency networking. Low latency networking, when you hear about latencies, this is one of the concepts that you're going to be hearing a lot in the cloud or in the IT world, latencies, which just means that the time it takes you to request a data and the time it goes to you. For instance, now, if you go to some websites, if you click a button, it will take some time to actually load. That means that that website has a high latency. And the reason for that might be that the data center or the server that is serving that particular content is very far away. So when you click a button on a data on this website and it takes some time before it's load, that means that website have a high latencies. So in order for customers' data to have a extreme low latencies, AWS make the data centers, I mean the availability zones not to be far away from each other. Every availability zone, the minimum, I mean the distance is like 60 miles away from each other, which is not extremely too far away compared to region. One region might be in Africa, then the another region might be in Asia, which is far away. But availability zones, all availability zones of a particular region are like 60 miles away from each other. So you can select any availability zones that you want to deploy your resources. But if you are deploying a resources, your availability zone that you want to select, make sure they are in the same region, except if you have a requirement that says you have to deploy the resources in multiple regions. So as I was saying earlier, we can have just one data center in an availability zones. And at the same time, we can have multiple data centers in an availability zones. So in the AWS make it possible for you to pick a specific availability zone that you want to deploy your resources. But one thing that you cannot do, you cannot pick a specific data center. So if you want to deploy resources, you can choose, when you are deploying the resources in an availability zone, that resources might be deployed in a particular data center or in another data center, but whichever data center it is, you don't know. But what you can say is that you can pick a specific availability zones. So this is the AWS overview. This thing is not properly arranged. So now let's look at the relationship between data center, availability zones, and region. If you look at my diagram here, you will see that we have multiple data centers. And all these data centers, they are categorized as availability zones. So in a particular availability zones, which are colored brown, in a particular availability zone, you have multiple data centers there. And inside a region, you have multiple availability zones. So let's take a look at how AWS name this region, because AWS have data centers in a lot of regions and they give them names. You might hear something like data centers in the North Virginia, but they will not call it data center in the North Virginia. They actually give them a specific name. And how they name them is that they are going to pick the area that data center belongs. So if a data center is in US, they start the name with UX. If the data center is in Europe, they start the area name with EU. Then followed by the sub area. Then depends on how many regions. In that particular area. Then they start numbering it. Maybe US is 1, US is 2. If they have like 3 or 4 data centers in a particular region, they might have US is 1, US is 2, but the different region has different numbers of data, different numbers of region. In USA, we have 4 different regions. We have US is 1, we have US is 2, then we have West 1 and West 2. Then in Europe, there's many. In Africa, we only have 1 in South Africa. So this is how to name a region. So how do we name an availability zones? So if you are naming, when AWS is naming an availability zone, or if you want to know the name of an availability zone, just once you know the region that availability zone belongs, then how many availability zones are in that region depends on, that is what we form their name. If we have like 3 availability zones in a region, then AWS gives them alphabetical order, like availability zone A, availability zone B, or C. That is if you have 3. If you have more than 3, like we have 6, then you have A, B, C, D, E. If you have 2, you just have A and B. So this is how AWS name their region. So if you look at all all these names together up to 1, that is the region. And if you want to know the availability zone, that is from the beginning to the letter is the availability zones. So now let's take a look on the factors to consider before you select a region, because this is actually very, very important. Before you pick a region, what do you consider? And also this is part of the cloud practitioner exams. When you are picking a particular region, before you deploy your resources in this particular region, what are the factors that you should consider? The first factor that you should consider when you are deploying resources, or when you are picking a region to deploy your resources, the first factor is the availability zone. Is the available, if the resources that you want to use is available in that region. Because AWS have a lot of resources, but not every region have the same resources. There are some regions that they don't have a specific resources. So if you go and pick that region for your service, then you will not be able to use that service because that service is not available in that region. Why? So the best region that everybody tends to use is the AWS US East 1, because that is the North Virginia region. So any resources that AWS is deploying, they tend to test it in that region first before they move it to every other region. So the second factor that you should consider is the proximity to the customers. How close is that region to your customer? Because if I have customers in Australia now and I'm in US, then it doesn't make any sense for me to deploy my resources in US because my customers, they are in Australia. So it's better for me to just pick a region in Australia and deploy my resources there. Wherever I deploy my resources, I can still manage it anywhere I am. So the next one is compliance with the data governance and legal requirements. There are some, if you work in IT, you know that there's a lot of compliance. So if there is a particular requirement or legal requirement or compliance or law that says you cannot deploy your customer data in a particular region, then you don't want to select that region. So compliance is one of the factors that you have to consider. And finally, other factors you need to consider is the price. There are some data centers, though the same resources, the same service can be different in 2 different regions. So you want to consider the price before you select a region where to deploy your resources. Now, let's take a look. Please be jotting your questions down. If you ask a question for me, I'll soon ask if you have a question for me. But these are just the theoretical part, and cloud practitioner is theoretical. It's not practical. So it's just for you to have the objective of this is just to know that, okay, these services are available and this is what is used for. So it's not something, if you are a cloud practitioner, they are not expecting you to deploy any resources or to go and spin up anything. It's just for you to know that, okay, some services, these services are available if you need them, or if you want to use this if you need this particular service or this particular thing, this is the service that you can use for it. So they are more theoretical. So I understand if you get bored, because me myself, I don't like talking too much. All right. See on module 2. So the next topic that we are going to look at is the local zone and wavelength. Local zone is just an extension of region. When AWS categorize their region, a region is a geographical location. So AWS have data centers everywhere. Just take, for example, now, let's take Houston, Texas. AWS do not have a region in Houston, Texas. But Houston, Texas is a very
12 o'clock or 11 o'clock. You get? Oh, you're not going again. I won't go now. I'll be telling you in the evening. Evening, I can't wait for you. Now you can't tell me.
Henry. I mean,
Emmanuel.
Emmanuel.
For even book flight itself. For even book flight itself. That this thing good.
Yes. Emmanuel, you are disturbing me. I can't see your name, but I can hear your voice. I think he moved himself. All right. So if you look at Houston is a very big city, but there is no region there. So what happens if majority of your clients, they are in Houston, but the closest region or the closest availability zones that you can deploy your resources is in North Virginia? So that means you have to deploy your resources in North Virginia. So AWS understand this, and they listen to customer requests. They now extend the region. They extend their region. It's still closer, but it's another region entirely. So inside a region, I mean, a local zone is just like a region, but the difference is that inside a region, you have a lot of availability zones, you have a lot of data centers, and majority of these data centers, they are well equipped, meaning that everything you need for a service, you can find it in a particular data center. But when we talk about region, I mean, when we talk about our local zone is like, it's just an extended of a region. You can call it like a mini availability zones, but they only have is a limited resources in there. So a limited resources, just like compute, storage, and database, and some selected AWS services, meaning that it does not have a full capacity of an availability zone. So if you go to an availability zone now, you might, I mean, if you are using an availability zone, if you pick an availability zone, you might be able to do what is called data migration. You might be able to do something like they call machine learning. You might be able to do something like, that is called data lake, security lake, or CI/CD pipeline. You have all those resources in an availability zone, in most availability zones. But if you need those resources, but you don't want to use an availability zone because those availability zones are far away from your customer, then you can use local zone. But the disadvantage of a local zone is that it does not have the full capacity of an availability zone, though it's still categorized under a region, just like an availability zones, but it does not have the full capacity of an availability zone. So that's why you say it's still an extension of a region, which means that you can actually categorize a local zone as another availability zone, which is within a region, but it's just that it doesn't have the full capacity of an availability zone. Then the next one is what is called wavelength zones. The wavelength zones are majorly for mobile deployment. If you create an application that needs to be deployed on your customers' phones, and if they need extreme low latencies, that means it has to be extremely fast, just like those people that play game on their phone or their stream on their phone. If you develop an application, a gaming application or a streaming application that your customer has to use on their phone, then you can deploy that application on a wavelength zone. So wavelength zones are actually like they are AWS services embedded in the cloud, in the communication provider, like AT&T, like Verizon, like Spectrum. So these are like a small data center, or AWS services that is embedded in those in those networking provider, so that your application that you need to serve your customer, your gaming application or your mobile application that you need to serve your customer, can actually use the speed of the telecommunication. So this is just a AWS embedded their service in the telecommunication data center, so that your customer can actually enjoy that speed that they need for their mobile application. The other one that I said I'm going to talk about, but it's not here, is what is called the outpost. The outpost is also like, if you want to use AWS services, but you don't want to use the public cloud, and you don't have the capacity to, you don't want to use the public cloud with everybody, but you just want to use a specific AWS service, then you can talk to AWS to deploy that service in your own data center. So it's still cloud, but you are not using the public cloud, and you are not building a full structure cloud as a private cloud. You are not building a full structure private cloud. You just need some specific service. Let's say, for instance, you need just a compute, or you need just a storage. Instead of you to use the storage in the public cloud, you can actually talk to AWS that they should come and embed, or they should bring their storage cloud to your own data center. So you are only using that specific service, but not the full data center. So that is outpost. Then the next one that we're going to look at, and this one is very, very common, even in solution architect, edge location. Edge location is not a data center, meaning that AWS do not provide, they do not provide all the service of a data center. They only provide like a node or a server. So they have a site. They have a site where the only thing you see in that site is just like a server. We call it node, N-O-D-E. So that node is just to make sure that they use it to move your content closer to the people. Just imagine if I have an application here in Kansas, and people in Dallas, Texas, they want to use my application. Then instead of me going to deploy my resources in an availability zone closer to Dallas, then I say, okay, my customer actually need a very low latencies. Then the other means I can do is to use a local zone. If there is no local zone there, then the only alternative that I have now is edge location. So edge location is only used to cache content. You only use it to cache a content. Just like, for instance, majority of people that watch Netflix now, if you are in Africa and you are watching Netflix, if Netflix office or where they are, if Netflix data center is actually in Kansas here, and you are in Africa and you want to watch Netflix, what happened behind the scene is that the first person that clicked that video, the video content will actually be requested from the Kansas here. But immediately that first person watched that video, then immediately it requests that video, then the video will be cached in a edge location, maybe in Lagos or in Abuja, that is closer to those in Africa. So the next person that wants to watch that video, the video will not come, I mean, the request will not come to Kansas, it will go to where it was cached. So that way, it's extremely fast to them. So that is the concept at times when you want to view a website on your system. When you reload with the website, it's still giving you the old information because the website was actually cached on your system so that when you need it, you can quickly get it instead of making another request. If you don't understand this concept very well, don't bother. When we get to solution architect, we're still going to be discussing this. I'm going to be looking at a service under this called CloudFront. So edge location is just used as a caching content, to cache a content, so that everybody that are requesting for that content, they are not going to the original source. They are only using a place that is closer. So another example is like, let's say you're deploying your application in Houston, for instance now. Or okay, don't let me use that. For example, those people that cook. If you want to cook, the first thing you do, you might go to the pantry and get all the recipe and put it like on a counter or very close to your stove, so that when you need it, you just get it. And when you are done, then you can return them. So it's better that way than when you need something, you have to go to the original source and grab it. So that is the concept of edge location. Edge location, if you see any question that is talking about content delivery, is talking about edge location, because it's used to deliver cached content to your customer. So edge location is a site that is used by AWS service called CloudFront. And when we get to solution architects, we're going to be seeing, we're going to go deep into edge location, because there are some topics some service that we need to cover under this, like CloudFront and Route 53. But you don't really need to bother about it now, because we're still going to cover them later. So as I said earlier, the edge location is used a node or a server for a global content delivery. So it's just like a server. You have a server in a particular site, so that when people that are closer to that server need your service or need your application, it doesn't have to, that request does not have to go to the original place where you are keeping the content. It will just go to where it is cached, and your customer can get the data from there. And one thing that this edge location is used for is to reduce traffic to the original server, because the original server might be somewhere in Texas, and those people that need the data are in Africa. So instead of everybody in Africa to be coming to Dallas or to Texas to get that content, it's only the first person that comes to Dallas or Texas to get the content. And once that person gets the content, then it keeps the content very close to other people in Africa. So that way, any other people that need the content, they don't have to come to Dallas again. So another thing is, it's located, we have a lot of edge location spread across the globe. So it doesn't mean that everybody in Africa has to use the same edge location. You might have an edge location in Lagos. You might even have 3 in Lagos. You might have 4 in Abuja. You might have in Imo. So it's spread across. So anybody that is closer to a particular edge location that need the content first has to go to the original source. But immediately you get it from the original source, then that content will be cached in edge location that is closer to them. So let us take a look at how AWS, other naming conventions of AWS. If you look at my screen now, these are some of the names of AWS region. You have US East, some data center, some region that is US East, and the region identifier is US East 1. Then we have those one in Ohio. This is US East 2. In West North California, US East 1. You do not need to memorize all of this because you can get it anytime you need. When we get to the console now, later today, I'm going to show you where you can pick before you deploy any resources. Make sure that you know the region that you are deploying that resources by clicking a button that you are selecting this region, and that is where it is that region your resources will be deployed. So now, before we go to the management console, before we go to the console, there are multiple means or multiple ways of interacting with AWS. There are multiple ways. The first and the most common way is through the management console. We're about to go to the console now, so I would think you guys can pay attention now. The first and the most common way is through the management console. And that is when you actually go to the browser, put in your username, put in your password, and then you are in the management console. Then the second one, okay, we're going to go to break. Before we go to the management console, let me just explain this fully. Then we go on 5-minute break. I almost forgot. So the second one is through the command line interface. The command line interface is when you actually use command, like writing of code, to interact with AWS services. The third one is through the software development kit. This is for developers, so we are not going to go anywhere near this for this course. So this is when developers are actually using what is called API, Application Programming Interface, to talk to AWS services and embed some AWS services in their application. If under solution architect, we are going to be seeing some of these interacting with AWS console, interacting with AWS with software development kits, which is called Boto3. Then there's another one which I do not include here. It's actually called infrastructure as code. The infrastructure as code is another means where people normally interact with AWS, but a lot of people categorize it under software development kit. That is fine, but to be honest with you, it's just another means entirely of interacting with AWS. So let's go on 5 minutes break. When we come back, we are going to go straight to the console. Then here we will start seeing, this is where the main work starts. Although it's still cloud solution architect, we're still not going to be deploying a lot of resources, but you're going to start getting yourself familiar with the actual AWS interface. So now I'm going to pause the video, or let me just stop it. When we come back, please remind me to start the video again. Then we're going to start, we jump into the console straight. All right, 5 minutes break.